Sarah Mitchell had stopped believing in moments that changed everything. At 34, she'd learned that life moved in increments so small you barely noticed them accumulating into years. Another morning alarm. Another staff meeting about literacy standards. Another Friday night with a microwave dinner and her cat Oliver curled against her leg. His purr the only sound in the flat besides the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of Manchester traffic through single-pane windows that never quite kept out the cold. The divorce had been finalized 2 years earlier, though the marriage had ended long before the paperwork. No dramatic confrontation, no infidelity that she knew of, just the slow recognition that she and David had become strangers who happened to share a mortgage. When they sold the house in Stockport and divided everything with painful civility, Sarah took her half and moved into a one-bedroom in Chorlton, telling herself it was temporary. A place to regroup, reset, figure out what came next. But nothing came next. Just more mornings and more evenings, and the peculiar loneliness of being surrounded by people all day at Northwood Primary School and still feeling utterly alone. She was good at her job. The children loved her. Parents requested her class. But she'd started noticing how she talked to adults the same way she talked to 7-year-olds. Her voice taking on that bright, encouraging tone even when buying coffee or making small talk with other teachers in the staff room, as if she'd forgotten how to be a person outside the role she played. It was her friend Claire who'd pushed her toward the holiday. They'd been having lunch at a cafe in Didsbury, rain streaking the windows, when Claire set down her fork and looked at Sarah with the kind of directness that comes from 20 years of friendship. "You need to leave," Claire had said. "Not forever, just leave. Go somewhere warm. Go somewhere alone. Remember what it feels like to be Sarah instead of Miss Mitchell." The idea felt almost absurd. Sarah didn't take spontaneous holidays. She planned things months in advance, created spreadsheets, read reviews. But something in Claire's words had landed differently that day. Maybe it was the gray sky that seemed to press against the cafe windows like a physical weight. Maybe it was the fact that half-term break was coming and she had absolutely nothing to fill it with except lesson planning and Netflix. Maybe it was just exhaustion with the smallness of everything. She'd booked the trip that evening. 2 weeks in Antalya, Turkey, a resort hotel with good reviews, near the old town, close enough to the beach that she could hear the Mediterranean from her balcony. She'd chosen Turkey almost randomly, drawn by photographs of turquoise water and ancient ruins, by the promise of October sunshine when Manchester would be drowning in autumn rain. She told her mother she was going with friends, knowing the worry that would come if she admitted it was solo travel. She told herself it was just a holiday, nothing transformative, just a chance to read books on a beach and eat good food and maybe, briefly, stop feeling like her life had somehow finished before it properly began. The flight from Manchester to Antalya was half empty. Sarah sat by the window and watched England disappear beneath clouds, that familiar landscape of gray and green she'd known her entire life. 4 hours later, she stepped into Mediterranean heat that wrapped around her like a physical embrace. The air smelled different here, salt and pine and something sweet she couldn't identify. The sky was a blue so vivid it looked artificial. The first 2 days she barely left the hotel. She swam in the pool, read 3 chapters of a novel she brought, ordered room service, and felt the tension in her shoulders slowly begin to unknot. She walked along the beach at sunset, feet in the foam, and thought about nothing in particular. Let herself exist without purpose or productivity. It felt strange, almost uncomfortable, but also necessary in a way she couldn't quite articulate. On the 3rd day, she ventured into the old town. Khaleesi, the concierge had called it, handing her a small map with recommended cafes and shops marked in highlighter. The narrow streets were cobblestone, lined with Ottoman-era houses painted in faded pastels, bougainvillea spilling over walls in cascades of pink and purple. Tourists moved in clusters, cameras raised, but Sarah walked alone, deliberately slowly, trying to absorb the foreignness of everything. The call to prayer echoing from minarets, the smell of grilled meat and spices from street vendors, the musical quality of Turkish conversation happening around her, incomprehensible but somehow soothing. She found the cafe almost by accident, drawn by its position overlooking the marina where wooden boats bobbed gently in the harbor. It was small, just 6 or 7 tables, half of them empty. She ordered a Turkish coffee and a pastry she couldn't pronounce, pointing at the display case and smiling apologetically at the young woman behind the counter. That was when Mehmet appeared. He'd been sitting at a corner table, she realized later, though she hadn't noticed him when she walked in. He spoke first, in English, his accent adding a melodic quality to the words. "Your first time in Turkey?" Sarah looked up, startled. He was handsome in an understated way, dark hair just beginning to gray at the temples, maybe 40, with warm brown eyes and an easy smile that didn't feel predatory or pushy, just genuinely curious. "Is it that obvious?" she asked, laughing a little. He gestured to the pastry she'd ordered. "Only tourists choose the baklava. Locals know it's too sweet in the afternoon. You want barak, savory, much better with coffee." She felt herself relax in a way she hadn't expected. They talked for 20 minutes that first day. He introduced himself, Mehmet Yilmaz, told her he managed his family's textile business, importing fabrics from across Turkey and exporting to Europe. He'd grown up in Istanbul, but spent summers in Antalya where his parents had retired. He spoke about the city with obvious affection, asked about her life in England with what seemed like genuine interest. When she mentioned she was a teacher, his face lit up. "My mother was a teacher," he said. "Primary school, like you. She always said it was the most important work because you shape how children see the world." There was something in the way he said it, a respect and warmth, that made Sarah feel seen in a way she hadn't in months, maybe years. They exchanged phone numbers before she left, though she told herself it was just polite, tourist friendliness, nothing more. But he texted that evening, just a simple message asking if she'd enjoyed the rest of her day, recommending a restaurant near her hotel if she wanted authentic Turkish food. She went to the restaurant. The food was extraordinary. She told him so. He suggested they have lunch the next day, promised to show her parts of Antalya tourists never found. She should have said no, should have recognized the pattern, the charming local man pursuing the lonely foreign woman. But Sarah was tired of being careful, tired of protecting herself from disappointment. And Mehmet didn't feel dangerous. He felt easy, comfortable, like someone she'd known longer than 3 days. They fell into a rhythm. He'd meet her in the mornings, drive her to hidden beaches or small villages in the hills where his family had connections, introduce her to his favorite foods and places. He never pushed physically, never made her uncomfortable. Their hands brushed once, reaching for the same plate of meze at a cliffside restaurant, and the electricity of it surprised her. But he pulled back, apologized, remained respectful. It was on the 8th day that everything shifted. They'd spent the afternoon exploring ancient ruins at Perge, walking among crumbling columns and streets where Romans had walked 2,000 years before. The scale of history made Sarah feel both small and strangely liberated. What were her problems? Her failed marriage, her quiet loneliness against the weight of millennia. On the drive back, Mehmet had been quieter than usual. Finally, as the sun began to set over the Taurus Mountains, he pulled the car to the side of the road at a scenic overlook. "I need to tell you something," he said, and Sarah's stomach tightened, anticipating disappointment. A wife, a girlfriend, the revelation that this had all been performance. But instead he said, "I think I'm falling in love with you, and I know that's impossible. You're leaving in 6 days. You have a life in England. We barely know each other. But I needed to say it because I've never felt this with anyone, and I think you feel it too. And I don't want to let you leave without knowing that this is real for me." Sarah sat in the passenger seat, the Mediterranean spread out below them like hammered bronze in the fading light, and felt something crack open in her chest. It was real for her too. She'd been trying not to admit it, trying to keep this compartmentalized as a holiday romance, something that would end cleanly when she boarded her flight back to Manchester. But the truth was, she'd been falling too, had been imagining impossible futures, had been dreading the return to her small flat and her small life. They kissed as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and Sarah felt like she was in a movie, like her life had suddenly become the kind of story she'd stopped believing actually happened to real people. The remaining days blurred together in a haze of intensity. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing, building the kind of intimacy that usually takes months compressed into days because they both knew time was running out. Mehmet introduced her to his parents over dinner at their villa, a sprawling white house with views of the sea. His mother, I.e., embraced Sarah like a daughter, insisted on teaching her how to make gözleme, laughed warmly when Sarah's attempts fell apart. His father, Hassan, told stories about the old days in Istanbul, treated Sarah with gentle courtesy. "You make my son happy," I.A. said in careful English, squeezing Sarah's hand as they cleared dishes. "I see it in his eyes. He's been waiting for someone like you." On her last night, Mehmet drove them back to the overlook where he'd first confessed his feelings. The stars were extraordinary, dense and bright in a way they never were in Manchester. "Come back," he said, "or let me come to you. This doesn't have to end." Sarah wanted to say yes immediately, but the practical part of her, the part that had been protecting her for years, hesitated. "How would that even work?" she asked. "You have your business here. I have my job. We live in different countries. People figure it out," he said. When something matters, you find a way. I'm not asking you to decide everything tonight. Just don't decide it's over. She flew back to Manchester the next morning with his goodbye kiss still burning on her lips and a promise to talk every day. England felt smaller than she remembered. Her flat looked dingy and cramped. The sky was the color of concrete. At school, the children seemed louder, more demanding. Her colleagues' conversations about standardized testing and budget cuts felt suffocating. She went through the motions, smiled when expected, marked papers and planned lessons, but her real life was happening in the hours she spent on WhatsApp with Mehmet, in the late-night video calls where he'd show her Istanbul at night, the Bosphorus lights reflected in dark water. Claire noticed the change immediately. "You're glowing," she said over lunch 3 weeks after Sarah's return. "What happened in Turkey?" Sarah told her everything, expecting skepticism or warnings. Instead, Claire smiled. "I've known you 20 years, she said. "I've never seen you look like this. If he makes you this happy, don't talk yourself out of it because it seems impossible." That evening, Sarah booked another flight to Istanbul. Just a long weekend, she told herself, to see if what they'd felt in Antalya was real or just holiday magic. Mehmet met her at Istanbul airport with flowers, drove her through the chaotic beauty of the city to a boutique hotel in Sultanahmet, where he'd reserved a room with a view of the Blue Mosque. That weekend confirmed everything. The connection was real. The feelings hadn't been exaggerated by circumstance. If anything, they deepened. Over the next 6 months, Sarah made the trip 7 more times. Mehmet came to Manchester twice, though his business made it harder for him to leave Turkey for long periods. Each separation became more painful. Each reunion more intense. They started talking about futures, about possibilities. Sarah researched teaching English in Istanbul, looked into international schools, explored what it would take to build a life split between 2 countries. It was Mehmet who first mentioned marriage. They were walking along the Bosphorus on a cold February evening, Sarah wrapped in a coat she'd bought in Istanbul's Grand Bazaar, when he stopped and turned to her. "I want you in my life permanently," he said. "Not visits, not long distance. I want to wake up next to you every morning. Build something real together. Will you marry me?" Sarah should have thought longer, should have considered the practicalities, the cultural differences, the fact that they'd spent maybe 40 actual days together total. But she was tired of being careful, tired of the voice in her head that always chose safety over possibility. She said yes. They married 4 months later in a small ceremony in Istanbul, his family in attendance, her mother and Claire flying out to witness it. Sarah wore a dress she'd found in a vintage shop in Beyoğlu, simple cream silk that felt right for a second wedding, for a second chance at everything. The imam who performed the ceremony spoke mostly Turkish, Mehmet translating the important parts, and Sarah repeated vows she only half understood, trusting that love was its own language. Standing there, Mehmet's hand warm in hers, surrounded by the foreign, beautiful strangeness of everything, Sarah felt certain she'd made the right choice, that she'd been brave enough to choose the bigger life, the colorful life, the life that felt like actually living. She gave notice at Northwood Primary at the end of term, packed her flat into boxes, sold most of her furniture, shipped what mattered to Istanbul, said goodbye to Claire with promises to visit, to stay close, to make this work. Her last night in Manchester, she stood at her empty flat's window, looking out at the familiar streets, the orange glow of streetlights in the rain. Oliver meowed from his carrier, confused by the emptiness. In 12 hours, she'd be on a plane. In 24 hours, she'd be home. Not England home anymore. Istanbul home. Mehmet home. The future felt wide open and full of promise, and Sarah let herself believe completely. Let herself trust that some stories really did have happy endings if you were just brave enough to reach for them. The first 3 months in Istanbul felt like living inside a postcard. Sarah woke each morning to the call to prayer echoing across the city, Mehmet's arm draped across her waist, sunlight filtering through sheer curtains in their apartment in Kadıköy. The neighborhood was everything he'd promised, vibrant and local, far enough from the tourist centers to feel authentic. Their building was old but charming, with high ceilings and original tile work, situated on a street lined with cafes and small shops where vendors greeted Mehmet by name. He'd enrolled her in Turkish lessons at a language school near Taksim Square. 3 mornings a week, Sarah sat in a classroom with other foreigners, mostly young professionals and embassy workers, stumbling through verb conjugations and pronunciation. The language felt impossible at first, its grammar structure entirely alien to everything she knew, but she attacked it with the same determination she'd once applied to lesson planning. Mehmet praised her efforts, corrected her gently over dinner, seemed genuinely proud when she managed to order coffee in Turkish or exchange pleasantries with their elderly neighbor. She'd connected with an international school about teaching positions, had an interview scheduled for the following term. In the meantime, she tutored English online, her students scattered across Asia and the Middle East. The work flexible enough that she could explore the city in the afternoons. She'd walk for hours, getting deliberately lost in neighborhoods whose names she couldn't pronounce, learning Istanbul's rhythms and textures. The city was enormous, chaotic, beautiful in ways that constantly surprised her. Ancient mosques next to modern shopping centers, cats everywhere, dozens of them, fed and cared for by communities as if they were public property. The Bosphorus cutting through everything, Europe on one side and Asia on the other, ferries crossing back and forth like shuttles between worlds. Mehmet's family embraced her completely. Sunday dinners at his parents' villa became ritual. Ia would cook elaborate meals, 5 or 6 courses, insisting Sarah eat more, always more. His father Hassan told the same stories, but Sarah didn't mind, found comfort in the repetition. Mehmet's 2 sisters, Elif and Zeynep, treated her like they'd known her forever, brought their children over for chaotic family gatherings where Turkish and broken English mixed into something that transcended language. This is what family's supposed to feel like, Sarah thought one Sunday, watching Mehmet's nephew toddle across the garden while Elif and Zeynep argued good-naturedly about whose burak recipe was superior. Not the strained politeness of her childhood, her mother's careful emotional distance, her father who'd left when she was 12. This was warmth and noise and belonging. But small things started shifting around the 4th month. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss or rationalize. Mehmet began commenting on her clothing. Just observations, nothing that sounded like commands. That dress is beautiful, but maybe too short for this neighborhood. We don't want to attract the wrong attention. Those jeans look very Western. Turkish women here dress more modestly. You might feel more comfortable in something looser. His tone was always gentle, framed as concern for her comfort, her safety, her integration into the culture. Sarah adjusted. She bought longer skirts, looser blouses, told herself it was respect, adaptation, the same as removing shoes before entering a mosque. She was living in a different culture now, different rules applied. He discouraged the friendships she'd started forming at the language school. There was Jennifer, a Canadian working for an NGO, and Marcus, a British guy teaching at one of the international schools. They'd grab drinks a few times after class, swapped stories about adjusting to Istanbul, laughed about linguistic misunderstandings and cultural confusion. When Sarah mentioned meeting them for dinner one Friday, Mehmet's face had clouded. Those expat people, he said, they don't really live here. They stay in their bubble, complain about Turkey, never actually integrate. You're different. You're actually building a life here, becoming part of this place. Why surround yourself with people who just see Istanbul as a temporary stop? It made sense the way he explained it. Sarah had noticed a certain superiority in some expat conversations, a tendency to criticize rather than understand. She started declining invitations, let those friendships drift. She had Mehmet's family, his friends. She didn't need a safety net of other foreigners. The Turkish lessons became another point of tension. She'd been making real progress, could navigate basic conversations, was starting to understand fragments of what she heard around her. But Mehmet started saying she was wasting money on the classes. I can teach you better than any school, he insisted. And anyway, most important people here speak English. You don't need to be fluent, just conversational. Save the money for when we buy a house. She quit the classes after 6 months, told herself it was practical. They were expensive. She could study on her own. Mehmet would help her practice, but he was always too busy to practice. His textile business, which he described as successful and established, seemed to demand constant attention. He left early most mornings, returned late most evenings. When Sarah asked about visiting his office, maybe understanding more about his work, he demurred. It's very boring, just warehouses and paperwork. You'd hate it. When she pushed gently, suggested she'd like to see that part of his life, he grew irritated. Why don't you trust me? Is it because I'm Turkish? You think I'm hiding something? The accusation stung. Sarah backed off, apologized for implying anything, felt guilty for her suspicion. Of course she trusted him. They were married. She'd moved across a continent to be with him. The bank account issue emerged around month 7. They'd opened a joint account shortly after Sarah arrived, had pooled their resources. It made sense for shared expenses, for building their future together. Sarah had transferred most of her savings, the money from selling her share of the house with David, about £40,000. It had seemed smart at the time, practical. But when she tried to access the online banking one afternoon to check their balance, transfer money for an online tutoring payment, her login didn't work. She asked Mehmet about it that evening. Oh, I had to reset some security settings, he said casually. Turkish banks are very particular about foreign access. They were flagging your logins as suspicious. I'll give you the new password tonight. He didn't. When she reminded him the next day, he seemed annoyed that she brought it up. Why do you need constant access? I handle all our bills, manage everything. You just worry about your tutoring and settling in. I'll take care of the finances. Something cold settled in Sarah's stomach, but she pushed it away. She was being paranoid. This was probably normal in Turkish marriages, traditional gender roles around money management. And Mehmet had always been responsible, reliable. Except she'd noticed things. The apartment they lived in wasn't owned by Mehmet like he'd implied. They were renting. The textile business he'd described so confidently seemed smaller than she'd imagined. She'd seen mail addressed to him, past due notices for something, though he'd brushed it off as bureaucratic confusion when she asked. Then came the pregnancy. Sarah had been feeling off for 2 weeks before she took the test. Exhausted, nauseous, her body feeling foreign to itself. When the 2 pink lines appeared, she sat on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes, trying to organize her feelings. They hadn't been trying. Hadn't been preventing either, but hadn't actively decided. She was 35. Time was running out if she wanted children. But she'd imagined it happening later, once she had a job again, once they'd settled more completely into their life together. Mehmet was overjoyed. He picked her up and spun her around when she told him, called his mother immediately, insisted they go to his parents' house that evening to share the news. IE cried with happiness. Hassan embraced Sarah warmly. His sisters started planning a baby shower before Sarah had even caught her breath. This changes everything, Mehmet said that night, lying beside her in the dark. Now you're really family, really Turkish. Our child will be Turkish, will grow up here. We'll have everything we can give them. Sarah felt the weight of it, the permanence. A baby meant roots that went deeper than marriage papers. A baby meant she was bound to this country, this family, this life, in ways that couldn't be easily undone. The control tightened after that. Mehmet became obsessive about her health, her activities, where she went and with whom. You need to rest more. You're carrying our child. That neighborhood isn't safe for pregnant women. Don't take the ferry. The crowds could hurt you. Don't go out alone after dark. Istanbul is dangerous. She was allowed to visit his family. That was safe, approved. But her movements otherwise became circumscribed. When she suggested visiting Jennifer, who'd reached out after months of silence, Mehmet exploded. You want to hang out with drunk foreigners while you're pregnant? What kind of mother does that? You think about yourself, always yourself, never about our family, our baby. It was the first time he'd raised his voice at her. Sarah had stood in their kitchen, shocked into silence, watching this man she thought she knew transform into someone else entirely. He'd apologized later, blamed stress from work, from worry about being a good father. She'd accepted it because what else could she do? The isolation crept in slowly. Her online tutoring work became harder to maintain as her energy flagged. Mehmet suggested she stop, focus on the pregnancy. They didn't need the money anyway, but without work, without language classes, without friends, Sarah's world contracted to the apartment, to waiting for Mehmet to come home, to Sunday dinners with his family, where she smiled and nodded, and felt increasingly like a character in someone else's story. Her mother called weekly from Manchester, video calls where Sarah performed happiness. Everything's wonderful, the pregnancy is going well. Mehmet is so excited. She couldn't admit the truth because she didn't have words for it yet. Nothing was overtly wrong. Mehmet never hit her, never called her names. He was just protective, concerned. Maybe this was how Turkish husbands were. Maybe she was being ungrateful, judging him by British standards that didn't apply here. But doubt gnawed at her. Small observations accumulated. The way he checked her phone sometimes, casually, like it was normal. The way he changed all their passwords to things she didn't know. The way money seemed tight despite his claims about the successful business. The way his family, once so warm, now seemed complicit in her containment. When she'd mentioned to IE that she felt isolated, that maybe she could join some pregnancy groups to meet other mothers, IE had smiled and said, "You have us. Why do you need strangers? Family is everything." Sarah was 7 months pregnant when she discovered the truth about Mehmet's business. She'd gone to bring him lunch one afternoon, a gesture to surprise him, to feel connected to the part of his life he kept separate. She'd taken a taxi to the address he'd once mentioned in Zeytinburnu, an industrial area near the old city walls. The building was there, a warehouse complex painted the faded blue Mehmet had described, but when she asked the security guard for Yilmaz Textile, he'd looked confused. "No such business here," he'd said in broken English. "This building belongs to Yilmaz family, but they rent space to many companies." No textile business. Sarah had shown him a photo of Mehmet on her phone. The guard had nodded. Yes, Mehmet Bey. His uncle owns the building. Mehmet does some work here sometimes, deliveries, moving goods, but no business, just helping family. The ground had shifted beneath her feet. Sarah had stood in that industrial parking lot, taxis honking around her, pollution thick in her throat, understanding that everything Mehmet had told her was constructed on lies, not just exaggerations, fundamental fabrications about who he was, what he did, the life he promised. She'd confronted him that evening, hands shaking, trying to control the panic rising in her chest. His response was calm, almost amused. He sat on the couch, looked at her like she was being childish. What does it matter what the business is called? I work in textiles. My family has connections. I never lied about anything important. You told me you managed an import-export company, Sarah said, hearing her voice crack. You told me you had international deals, that you were established, successful, and I am successful. I provide for us, don't I? We have this apartment, food, everything you need. Why do you care about details? Because details matter, Sarah said. Because I moved my entire life here based on what you told me. Because I don't actually know who you are. Mehmet's face hardened then, a look she'd seen increasingly often but had been trying not to acknowledge. You knew who I was, he said quietly. You knew you were marrying a Turkish man, coming to live in Turkey, entering my family, my culture. You wanted the exotic romance, the Mediterranean fantasy. Well, this is reality. This is what you chose. And now you're pregnant with my child, in my country, and you're worried about business details? The truth in his words cut deeper than the lies. He was right in a terrible way. She had wanted the fantasy, had wanted to be rescued from her small English life by passion and adventure, had wanted to believe in transformation without cost, and she'd been so busy performing her own fantasy that she'd never looked closely at his. That night, lying beside him in the dark, feeling their baby kick against her ribs, Sarah understood the trap completely. She was in Istanbul with limited Turkish, no job, no independent money, no support network, 7 months pregnant with a child who would be Turkish by birth, subject to Turkish law. If she tried to leave, Mehmet would fight for custody, and he would win. The legal system here favored fathers, especially local fathers over foreign mothers. She'd read the horror stories online, British women trapped in Turkey by custody battles, unable to return home because taking the child would be considered kidnapping. She'd married her holiday romance and buried herself alive. The next morning, Mehmet acted like nothing had happened, brought her tea, kissed her forehead, left for work with a reminder to rest. Sarah sat at the window of their apartment, watching Istanbul move below her, and wondered how she'd been so blind. Every red flag had been there. She just hadn't wanted to see them because seeing them would have meant admitting she'd made a catastrophic mistake, had chosen wrong, had let loneliness and hope override every instinct of self-preservation. She started researching quietly. Turkish family law, British consular services, women's shelters in Istanbul. Every search felt dangerous. Mehmet monitored her phone, her computer. She had to delete browser histories, use incognito mode, be constantly vigilant. The baby arrived in late August, a daughter they named Elif after Mehmet's sister. The birth was long and difficult. 23 hours of labor in a hospital where Sarah understood maybe half of what was said to her. Mehmet was there but distant, on his phone, more interested in announcing the birth to his family than comforting Sarah through contractions. When they placed Elif in her arms, Sarah felt love and despair in equal measure. This tiny, perfect human, with Mehmet's dark eyes and Sarah's pale skin, was the final lock on the prison. She couldn't leave now even if she found a way. She couldn't abandon her daughter, and she couldn't take her because Turkish law wouldn't allow it. Mehmet's mask dropped completely after Elif was born. The pretense of the caring husband evaporated. He became openly controlling, critical, dismissive. Her body disgusted him now, stretched and changed from pregnancy. She wasn't trying hard enough to lose the weight. She was too focused on the baby, not focused enough on him. She didn't cook properly, didn't clean properly, didn't understand how Turkish wives were supposed to behave. When she tried to push back, he reminded her of her dependence. I provide everything for you. This apartment, food, clothes, everything. You contribute nothing. You're lucky I'm willing to support you. Her passport disappeared. Mehmet claimed it needed renewal processing through the consulate, paperwork he would handle. Weeks became months. When Sarah asked about it, he grew angry. Why do you need it? Planning to run away? You're not going anywhere with my daughter? She contacted the British consulate from a borrowed phone, a device she bought secretly with money saved from months of tiny economies. The consular officer was sympathetic but limited in what she could offer. "We can issue an emergency travel document if necessary, but if your daughter has Turkish citizenship, which she does through her father, you cannot leave Turkey with her without his permission or a court order." And Turkish courts almost never grant permission for a mother to take a Turkish child out of the country permanently. Sarah was 20 months into her Turkish life, their daughter 9 months old, when she finally accepted the complete truth of her situation. She was trapped, not by physical chains but by law, by citizenship, by a web of dependencies and control so complete that escape was impossible without losing everything that mattered. She'd come to Turkey chasing a dream of color and passion and transformation. She'd found all of it, but the cost was her freedom, her identity, her future. The dream had become a grave, and she was buried in it, alive and aware and helpless to dig herself out. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March, when Elif was 18 months old and Sarah had been in Istanbul for just over 3 years. The realization that finally shattered her denial wasn't dramatic. It was small, almost absurd in its ordinariness. Sarah was changing Elif's diaper in their cramped bedroom when she caught her reflection in the mirror across the room. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. The woman staring back was hollow-eyed, 20 pounds thinner than she'd been in Manchester, her hair pulled back in a perpetual ponytail because Mehmet complained when she wore it down, said it looked unkempt. She was wearing one of the shapeless long dresses he preferred, colors muted to the point of invisibility. She looked like a ghost, like someone who'd already died but kept moving through the motions anyway. Elif babbled something in Turkish, a language she was learning faster than English despite Sarah's efforts. Even her daughter was becoming foreign to her, more Yilmaz than Mitchell, more Turkish than British. Mehmet's family spoke to her exclusively in Turkish now, dismissing Sarah's weak protests. She needs to be Turkish, they insisted. This is her country, her identity. That morning, Sarah made a decision. Not to escape, she'd long ago accepted that was impossible, but to try one last time to reach someone who might help. The British embassy had been useless, sympathetic, but legally powerless. Turkish women's organizations had limited resources and focused primarily on physical domestic violence, not the psychological imprisonment Sarah experienced. But there was one person she hadn't contacted. Claire. She'd stopped talking to Claire months ago, partly because Mehmet monitored her communications, partly because shame made honesty impossible. How could she tell her oldest friend that she'd been right to worry, that the fairy tale romance had been a trap, that Sarah had been stupid and desperate enough to walk into it willingly? But that morning, with Elif playing with blocks at her feet, and Mehmet gone to whatever his actual work was, Sarah pulled out the secret phone she kept hidden in a box of tampons, the one place Mehmet would never look. She'd been careful with it, turning it on only when completely alone, communicating in fragments that could be deleted immediately. She typed out a message to Claire not asking for rescue. That was impossible. Just confessing the truth, needing someone, anyone, to know what had happened to her. The response came within an hour. Sarah, oh my God, I've been so worried. Your mom has been going mad. Nobody's heard from you properly in months. What's happening? How bad is it? They messaged back and forth for 20 minutes, Sarah typing frantically, pouring out everything. The lies about Mehmet's business, the financial control, the passport situation, the isolation, the way his family formed a wall around her, complicit in keeping her contained, the impossibility of leaving with Elif, the way Turkish law made her a prisoner. Claire's responses were horrified, furious, and ultimately helpless. I'm going to call the embassy, she wrote. There has to be something they can do. This is kidnapping. It's abuse. It's illegal. But Sarah knew better. She'd already explored every option. It's not illegal here, she typed back. I married him legally. Elif is Turkish. I signed papers I didn't fully understand. I made choices, even if I didn't know what I was choosing. On paper, everything is legitimate. Then come home without her, Claire wrote. I know that sounds impossible, but you can't live like this. Come home, get stable, fight for custody from England. Sarah stared at those words for a long time. Leave Elif, abandon her daughter to Mehmet's family, to a life where Sarah would be erased from her story, become the British mother who ran away, who didn't love her enough to stay. The thought was unbearable. But so was staying. She deleted the message thread, turned off the phone, hid it again. That conversation had cracked something open inside her, a desperate animal part of her brain that had been dormant. Maybe there was a way out. Not perfect, not without tremendous loss, but possible. Over the next 2 months, Sarah planned. She was meticulous, careful, drawing on the same organizational skills she'd once used for lesson planning. She needed money, she needed documents, she needed a window of opportunity when Mehmet would be distracted enough for her to move. The money came slowly. She started tutoring English again online, just one or two students, telling Mehmet the extra income would help with Elif's expenses. He allowed it, not realizing she was routing the payments to a separate account she'd opened using her emergency travel document, a bank that didn't share systems with their joint account. £40 here, £60 there. In 2 months, she accumulated almost £800. Not enough to start over, but enough to get to England to survive the first few weeks. The documents were harder. The British consulate had issued her an emergency travel document months ago, but it was useless without Elif. She needed Elif's British passport, which required Mehmet's signature on the application as the father. She'd tried forging it once, hands shaking, but the consulate employee had looked at the signature too closely, asked questions Sarah couldn't answer convincingly. That avenue was closed. But Elif had a Turkish passport. Mehmet had obtained it shortly after her birth, necessary for domestic travel within Turkey. He kept it in his desk drawer, along with other important documents. If Sarah could get it, she could at least move Elif around Istanbul, create some mobility, some breathing room to plan the next step. The opportunity came in late May. Mehmet's family was planning a gathering at a cousin's house in Bursa, a city about 2 hours from Istanbul. The whole family would go, make a weekend of it. Mehmet had mentioned it casually, said Sarah and Elif would come, of course, like there was any question. But Sarah planted a seed. She told Aya that Elif had been fussy, possibly coming down with something. Maybe it was better if they stayed home this weekend, let her rest. Aya agreed immediately, maternal concern overriding any suspicion. Mehmet was less convinced, but Sarah played it carefully. You go, spend time with your family. Elif and I will rest, we'll be fine. I know how important these gatherings are to you the Friday. They were supposed to leave. Sarah made sure Elif actually seemed slightly unwell. Not sick enough to cancel the trip entirely, just fussy enough to justify staying home. A late nap disruption. Skipping lunch, so she was cranky. Small manipulations that made Sarah hate herself but felt necessary. Mehmet left at noon, annoyed but accepting. We'll be back Sunday evening, he said. Don't leave the apartment. Rest. I'll have my mother check on you tomorrow. Sarah waited 3 hours after he left, making absolutely certain he was gone, that this wasn't a test. Then she moved. Mehmet's desk drawer wasn't locked. Inside, she found Elif's Turkish passport, their marriage certificate, some financial documents she photographed quickly with her secret phone. She packed a small bag for herself and Elif, minimal clothing, diapers, formula, the emergency money in cash, her phone, both of them. She dressed Elif in layers despite the warm weather, knowing she couldn't carry much. At 4 o'clock, she left the apartment with her daughter, locked the door behind her, and walked to the taxi stand 2 blocks away. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold Elif. The British Embassy, she told the taxi driver in halting Turkish Beyoğlu. The drive took 40 minutes through Istanbul traffic. Sarah sat in the back, Elif on her lap, watching the city pass outside the window. The city that had promised so much and delivered a prison. These streets she'd walked with such hope 3 years ago, believing she was choosing adventure and love. She felt nothing now except mechanical determination. The embassy was a fortress, security gates and checkpoints. Sarah approached with her emergency travel document and Elif's Turkish passport, asked to speak with someone from consular services. The officer who met with her was a woman in her 50s named Margaret, patient and kind, but clearly accustomed to desperate situations. Sarah explained everything in a rush, words tumbling over themselves, the deception, the control, the passport situation, the impossibility of leaving with Elif legally. Margaret listened carefully, took notes, then delivered the answer. Sarah had known was coming, but hope might somehow be different. Mrs. Master. Yilmaz, I understand your situation, and I'm deeply sympathetic. But your daughter is a Turkish citizen. Under Turkish law, both parents must consent to a child leaving the country. Without your husband's permission or a Turkish court order, I cannot help you leave Turkey with Elif. If you attempt to do so, you'll be stopped at the border and potentially charged with attempted kidnapping. What if I leave without her? Sarah asked, the words like broken glass in her throat. Margaret's expression softened with pity. You can leave any time with your emergency travel document. We can facilitate that. But I have to be honest with you, if you leave without your daughter, establishing custody rights from the UK will be nearly impossible. Turkish courts will view it as abandonment. Your husband's family will have sole custody, and the chances of getting her back are essentially zero. So I'm trapped, Sarah said flatly. I wouldn't use that word, Margaret said carefully, but your options are very limited. You can stay and try to improve your situation within the marriage. You can leave and accept losing custody, or you can attempt to work through Turkish legal channels, file for divorce here, fight for custody in Turkish courts, though I should tell you, those cases rarely favor foreign mothers, especially against established local families. Sarah sat in that embassy office, fluorescent lights humming overhead, her daughter playing with a pen on the floor, and understood the absolute completeness of her trap. Every door led to loss. Every choice meant destruction. She thanked Margaret for her time, collected Elif, and left the embassy. On the street outside, she stood for a long moment, trying to decide what to do next. Going back to the apartment meant surrender. Staying out meant immediate discovery when IA came to check on them tomorrow. Running meant losing Elif forever. She was standing there, paralyzed by impossible choices, when her phone rang. Mehmet, her heart seized. How could he know? They weren't supposed to be back until Sunday. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice cold. "At the park near the apartment," Sarah lied quickly. Elif needed air. "What park? Which one exactly?" "The one with the playground," she said, mind racing. "By the bakery." "There's no bakery by that park," Mehmet said. "And I know you're not there because I have someone watching the apartment. I know you left with a bag. I know you went to Beyoğlu. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Sarah's vision tunneled. Someone watching, of course. She'd been so naive to think she had any privacy, any autonomy. "I'm coming back to Istanbul now," Mehmet said. "Stay exactly where you are. If you run, I will call the police. I will tell them you're trying to kidnap my daughter. You'll be arrested, you'll lose her forever, and you'll end up in a Turkish prison. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Sarah whispered. The call ended. Sarah looked down at Elif, who was reaching for a pigeon on the sidewalk, oblivious to the collapse happening around her. She thought about running anyway, getting to the airport, trying to board a plane, knowing she'd be stopped. She thought about finding a women's shelter, knowing Mehmet would track her through every legal channel. She thought about calling Claire, begging for help that couldn't come. Instead, she got another taxi and went back to the apartment. Mehmet arrived 3 hours later, his parents with him. Sarah was sitting on the couch, Elif asleep in her crib, when they walked in. What he said to her over the next hour was delivered calmly, coldly, without raised voice or physical violence. That was almost worse. The rationality of it, the complete control. "You think you can leave?" he said. "You think you have rights here? You're in my country, in my family, with my daughter. You have nothing, not money that I don't give you, no passport, no legal standing. You exist here because I allow it." He told her about the security cameras he'd had installed, hidden in the apartment, that she'd never noticed. He'd been watching her for months, he said, knew about the secret phone, knew about the separate bank account, had let her accumulate that pathetic 800 pounds because it amused him to watch her think she had options. "You married me because you were desperate," he continued. "A divorced British woman, lonely, past your prime, dreaming of romance. I saw that immediately. You were easy, you wanted to be saved. I gave you exactly what you wanted, and now you're upset because you don't like the reality? That's your problem, not mine." Sarah sat there and took it, every word a nail in her coffin, because what else could she do? His mother, Aya, who'd once embraced her so warmly, looked at Sarah with something like contempt. "You disrespect our family," she said in careful English. "You try to steal our granddaughter. You are ungrateful for everything we give you. This is Turkish hospitality you spit on." The final part of Mehmet's monologue was the worst. He explained her new reality with bureaucratic precision. She would move into the family compound, a house on the outskirts of Istanbul where his unmarried brother lived, where his grandmother lived, where there would always be people watching. She would have supervised access to Elif, but no independent time alone with her. She would surrender both phones. All computer use would be monitored. She would not leave the property without permission and escort. "This is for your own good," he said, "to keep you from making more stupid mistakes. To protect Elif from a mother who clearly can't be trusted. You can stay under these conditions, or you can leave Turkey alone right now. Your choice." It wasn't a choice, and they both knew it. Sarah moved into the family compound the next day. The room they gave her was small, more cell than bedroom, with a window that looked out on a concrete courtyard. Elif slept in a nursery down the hall, cared for primarily by Mehmet's grandmother and his sister Zeynep, who moved in to help. Sarah was allowed to see her daughter for supervised hours each day, to feed her and play with her, but never alone, never without someone watching to make sure she didn't try to run again. The weeks blurred into months. Summer came, oppressively hot. Sarah moved through the house like a ghost, speaking when spoken to, eating meals with the family in silence, holding Elif during her allotted hours and trying to memorize every detail of her daughter's face, because some part of her understood this couldn't last forever, that eventually something would. Old break completely. She tried one more time to contact the embassy, using the compound's computer when she thought no one was watching. Within an hour, Mehmet appeared. "They can't help you," he said simply. "I've already been in contact with them. I explained that you're mentally unstable, that you've been making wild accusations, that the family is caring for you during a difficult time. They noted it in your file. If you contact them again, it will only confirm what I told them." Sarah realized then that even the British government had abandoned her, or more accurately, couldn't help against the legal and cultural weight of Turkish family structure. A year passed, then another. Elif turned 3, then 4. She spoke primarily Turkish now, called Sarah Ann in the formal way of polite distance rather than the intimate Anisiayim she used with Mehmet's mother. She was growing up surrounded by the Yilmaz family, absorbed into their world, while Sarah became increasingly peripheral. A curiosity, the sad British woman who lived in the compound, who'd tried to steal a child and was being charitably tolerated. Sarah's mother managed one visit, flew to Istanbul and stayed in a hotel, met Sarah at a carefully chaperoned cafe meeting with Mehmet present. Her mother looked at her with such horror and pity that Sarah had to look away. They couldn't speak honestly with Mehmet there, translating selectively, controlling the narrative. Her mother left after 3 days, and Sarah knew from her face that she understood the situation was hopeless. Claire tried to mount some kind of legal intervention, contacted human rights organizations and lawyers in both countries. Nothing came of it. Sarah Yilmaz, formerly Mitchell, had entered Turkey legally, married legally, given birth to a Turkish child. She remained in her husband's family compound of her own free will. According to official records, there was no crime to prosecute, no international law being violated. Just a woman who'd made bad choices and was living with the consequences. By the time Elif was 5, Sarah had stopped imagining escape. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by numb acceptance. She existed in the compound, helped with cooking and cleaning, saw her daughter for supervised hours, and tried not to think about the life she'd had before. Manchester felt like another planet. Teaching felt like something that had happened to someone else. She was 39 years old, and her life was functionally over. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come to Turkey searching for something bigger, something more vivid and real than her small British existence. She'd wanted color and passion and transformation. She'd gotten all of it. But transformation can mean many things, and hers had been a descent, not an ascent. Her dreams hadn't lifted her up. They'd buried her. Sometimes, at night in her small room, Sarah would remember that first evening in Antalya when Mehmet had looked at her across a cafe table and said something that seemed romantic at the time. In Turkey, when you give your heart to someone, you give everything. And Turkey never gives back what it takes. She'd thought it was about passion, about the intensity of Turkish love. She hadn't understood it was a warning, a promise, a prophecy. Sarah Mitchell had married her holiday romance, and he buried her dreams in Istanbul. Buried them so deep that not even the British government could dig them out. She was trapped not by chains, but by law, by motherhood, by her own desperate choices made 3 years ago when she'd been too lonely to see the trap closing around her. The story had no happy ending, no dramatic escape, no rescue. Just a woman in a compound on the outskirts of Istanbul, watching her daughter grow up in a language she barely spoke, living in a family that treated her like a tolerated burden, waiting for nothing because there was nothing left to wait for. She'd wanted a bigger life. She'd gotten one. Just not the kind anyone would choose, not the kind anyone survives intact.